may recall, you saw me on the first day of class. I'm back for today, and I'll be here again next Monday. So Alan will be doing the class remotely on Wednesday. He got COVID. And so Wednesday, I assume he told you it's not in person, but next Monday is back. It's one day virtual. Okay, so I'm going to talk about EV policy. And so I should tell you a little bit more about myself. I'm a professor here in civil engineering and environmental science policy, but I'm also the director of the Institute of Transportation Studies. But for this topic, even more relevant is I'm a board member for the California Air Resources Group. So how many of you know what CARB is? Only a few of you. Okay, so CARB, as we've so fondly referred to it, California Air Resources Board, is the state government agency that's responsible for most of the climate, just about all of the climate and most of the air quality policies and regulations for California. And also because, well, I'm going to talk about CARB a little bit in California because California has been ahead of the rest of the 49 states, and actually, in many ways, the rest of the world. It actually is imitated around the world what we do. So I'm going to confuse you a little bit. Sometimes I'm going to say we, meaning CARB, and sometimes I'm going to say we, meaning the global we. And there's other we's coming up too, but I'll try to be distinct about that. So my staff, we had just had the 30th anniversary of the Institute of Transportation Studies. We had a big gala event in Sacramento Friday. I think that's where Alan. But the staff, my staff gave me this hat, and this is ITS. This is the logo, so that's why I'm wearing it. Okay, so I'm going to kind of give a little context how I approach this whole topic of electric vehicles and why and how, policy, and if it differs with, you know, Alan's, kind of raise your hand and say so, and you can talk about it. Or if you just have questions, you know. So this is clearly interactive. Okay, so one point is that when we talk about future electric vehicles, there's this idea of technological determinism, you know, and that means that this technology is going to come about because of its attributes, and it's going to be shaped, you know, by the social structure. The other way of thinking about it is socially determined, and that is that it is explicitly being chosen to influence all these other things. And I'm going to say it's socially determined because I don't think it would EVs would come about for a long time in a significant way if government policy wasn't involved in promoting it. And so that's one of the reasons why policy is so important. Okay, so the other reason why electric vehicles are so important, well, you know, the more fundamental reason why it's important is because it's one of the best strategies for reducing greenhouse gases. In fact, I would say everything we can do, the broad we, of all the strategies and policies and technologies that we could use to reduce to slow down climate change, reduce greenhouse gases, EVs are probably the second best choice. What would be the first choice?
Driving less.
What's that?
Driving less.
No, but it's a good guess.
Decarbonizing the grid?
Yes, decarbonizing the grid because, actually electric vehicles are not really zero emission unless electricity is zero emission. We do call electric vehicles zero emission vehicles, but it's really just because it's an easy way to refer to them, but it's not technically correct. But so the point is that if the electricity is not clean, the vehicle is really not being clean. And the reason why the electricity being clean is more important is because it's electricity for buildings, it's electricity for industry, not just transportation. So basically what we're talking about is converting our entire, most of our energy system to be powered by electricity and decarbonizing electricity so it is zero carbon opposed to it. Okay, so climate change is really important, but air pollution is, we'll talk a little bit about that as well. And so the role of policy, so here I say, it really is going to happen. We're going to talk about exactly how fast and why and so on. But for it to happen, as I said earlier, policy is really key. And so when we say policy, there's three major sets of policies that we're usually referring to. As you see here, the first one is incentives. In other words, incentives for people to buy the vehicle and also for industry to sell them. The other is policy to make sure we have chargers out there. And the third is actually the rules and policies that directly apply to the car companies. And I think what we've learned the last few years in California, in the US, around the world, a lot of different ways, is that the most important policy for accelerating the introduction of electric vehicles are mandates, actually I should say, mandates on the automakers. So they've got the technology, they know how to do it, they've got the supply chains, they're ready to roll it out. But at least in the beginning, they lose money selling them. So they're not going to do it very enthusiastically. Unless, you're Elon Musk and you know how to make them more cheaply and sell them better, then you can make money. The rest of them haven't figured out how to make money. So therefore, you need a mandate applied to it. And a big part of this class is talking about those mandates. And you've seen this. Oh, okay, no, this is different. Okay, so this is a graph that, we talk about electric vehicles, but as you know, there's basically three types of electric vehicles. The battery EVs, there's the plug-in hybrids, and the fuel cell electric vehicles. Have you talked much about fuel cells, electric vehicles in this class? Just a little bit? Okay. So those are basically the three options if when we talk about electric vehicles or zero emission vehicles. Now, of course, a plug-in hybrid is not really zero emission. So now we've started calling it a near zero emission vehicle, but that's kind of clumsy. So we just throw it, for most purposes, we just say they're all zero emission. And of course, then there's the upstream emissions that are not, but stick with me. Okay, so the challenge here is I'm going to show you that California is about to adopt regulations requiring that every single vehicle sold in California must be zero emission. Every single one of them. But if you start thinking about it, okay, we're telling the car companies they have to sell them, but people have to buy them. You can't sell it and no one buys it. Okay, so are we going to get to 100%, you think, looking at it from a consumer perspective? Think about vaccines. Can't get people vaccinated. So do we think we can get everyone to buy an electric vehicle? Okay, well, hang in there. You're young enough, you're going to find out. I'm young enough, I'm going to find it. But so part of the idea here is that electric vehicles now are being bought as are bought mostly by more affluent people and bought by people that have their own house with an easy way of charging their vehicle. 85, 90% of all charging is done at home. So public chargers, we say, are really important, and they will be, but not so much now, except for psychological reasons. Because, you know, people don't want to buy it if they think they're going to get stranded. They almost never do, but you know, that's how people think when they're making these cars. They're conservative. Okay, so if you think about this, you know, we're capturing now people that have their own house, can charge, and probably have multiple cars, but only one of them is electric, so they can just drive that electric into their garage and get it juiced up. But what happens when all three vehicles are electric and all three have to be charged? Maybe you have a big garage and you have wires and cables, you can do it, but probably not. What if you live in an apartment building or a condo? You know, so it's going to get hard. So in many ways, you know, we're starting to think that first 50% is actually going to be pretty easy, relatively. The last 20 or 30 could be much harder. And that's where plug-in hybrids and fuel cells will become more critical, because a fuel cell vehicle, you just drive to the station, fuel it up just like a gasoline car, and a plug-in hybrid, you can just run it on gasoline. If you run out of electricity, it's not a problem. So that's the question being raised here. Okay, so I just want to say, you know, this is not for you to memorize or know or anything. It's just to make the point, we have a market system. It's a capitalist system. That's how our economy works. And if you take an economics class, or you have an old-fashioned traditional economist teaching it, they say, it's all about the market, it's all about the prices. So if you're worried in this case about climate change, just increase the price a little bit to take into account the cost of climate change. Maybe add a little bit more for air quality, air pollution, and boom, the market will take care of itself. Because then gasoline cars will be more expensive relative to electric. Well, the world doesn't work. And for that economic approach really to work, the price of gasoline would have, you know, it's already what, $5, $6. It'd have to go probably to $15 to really make a big effect in how people make choices. You know, again, another way of thinking about it, new cars, who buys new cars? People that have money. You know, roughly only about a third of the households in the US buy new cars. 2/3 of the households buy used cars. Only 1/3. No, that 1/3 tends to be more affluent. Okay, so this is not really the market work. On top of that, there's all these market laws and market conditions, and that's what's listed here. That mean the market is not working. So this is just a placeholder slide to say we really need policy to make sure that decisions are made that are in the public interest. Government policy, government initiative, some sort is needed if we really want to make sure that car companies are making the right the investments that are in the public interest, utilities, electric utilities, consumers. It's not saying we completely manipulate people. That's not, but there's almost, even if you look at political spectrum, even the most conservative, right-wing person is going to say that, yes, we need a certain amount of government intervention to make sure that the society works in a way that's that serves the public. So that's a whole nother, course and so on. So feel free to jump in here. Okay, what are the possible policies then, now that we're talking about policies? So to make it simple, we often say there's the carrot and there's the sticks. And so the carrots are, how do you induce people or companies to change their behavior using the market system, like a carbon tax or a gasoline tax. A stick is where you beat someone over the head and tell them this is what you have to do. Think about your childhood growing up with your parents. They use both carrots and sticks, right? So we kind of, so to be a little more technical about this, the sticks are regulatory instruments, regulatory policies. That means that we are applying policies that are not relying on the market, but we're telling companies and individuals what they need to do. So that would be like a mandate on the car companies that say, you must sell 100% of your cars must be zero emission by 2035. So that's a regulatory instrument. It's a stick. In the old days, it used to be when I was younger during the Russia, when the Soviet Union and communism we're all hiding under our desks and things like that. We used to refer to these as command and control because we called the communist government system command and control. But that's kind of a demeaning way of expression, I think. So, in popular discussion, people will sometimes use that expression. What they really mean is regulatory. And so these regulatory instruments don't necessarily have to be thou shalt do this. It can be like a performance standard. So it's like we tell them your car is allowed to your car must emit 20 grams per mile. But you can have some that are above that, some are below it. It's a performance standard. It's not prescriptive. So other language you might hear, there can be a performance standard or a prescriptive standard. Prescriptive says you must put a catalytic converter in that car, or that car must be electric. But we tend in policy to try, I think good policy is using performance standards as much as possible. Okay, so other examples. Okay, so another policy we're about to adopt is telling owners of truck fleets, like Walmart, FedEx, UC Davis, that if they own trucks, then they must start buying a certain number of their trucks as zero emitting. And California's about to adopt that requirement soon. Actually, when I say California, almost always I mean card. So it's not my decision for it, but it is, I vote on these, so I'm on the card board. Okay, so yes, the other part about CARB is it's got a huge staff, I think 1,700 people, and then it's got a board of 13 or 14 people. So I hold the transportation seat on the board. About half of them are politicians, like mayors, county supervisors. There's one lawyer, there's one medical expert. So I'm the transportation expert. So we, the board, are voting on and adopting these policies. So we, CARB, will be adopting these mandates for automakers. We're in fact having our first hearing June 9th. So if you ever want to be both entertained and get an understanding of how policy works. And you know, you listen in on a link, and maybe I'll try to get Alan to provide you that link. So we're going to do that, and then later this year we're going to do this requirement on fleets that they must buy electric trucks, and we already adopted a rule I'll talk about requiring truck manufacturers to sell zero-emission trucks. That's already happened. The other two are in the works. Okay, so then you have the market instruments, and I include incentives because it's using money to incentivize people or companies to change their behavior. So market instruments are about using prices to change behavior. So as I said, it could be a tax, gasoline, diesel. We could raise, you know, one thing we could do is say the annual registration vehicle for a gasoline car is $500. The annual registration fee for an electric vehicle is $50. You know, we could do something like that, and some countries do that. So that would be another way of influence behavior by changing pricing signals and subsidies and rebates to companies and buyers. And we can use subsidies for chargers. So I don't know if Alan has said this, but there's almost no way to make money selling electrons to vehicles. And if you just do a simple calculation, you think, okay, how much does it cost to put a charger in? And then it takes, you know, so much time to sell so many electrons and it works so much. It's really hard to make the money back, and you got to be operating it almost full time. So, you know, you think about a gasoline station, gasoline pump, you know, in 4 minutes, you sell $60 worth of fuel. In 4 minutes with a charger, you sell, you know, what, 20 cents worth of electricity. Okay, so this is why we need government. We need some kind of subsidies. It doesn't have to be government. It doesn't have to be taxpayers, but we need some way of incentivizing companies to build chargers. And then there's non-monetary incentives. That's another category. Oh, and then this is my favorite one, the last one here, rebates. How many of you know what rebates are? All right, a few people. I think this is one of the most important policies California and the US need to adopt. And I'll come back to this a little bit, but very simply, it's if you buy a gasoline or diesel vehicle, you pay a fee. If you buy an electric, you get a rebate. And you can design it in such a way that the amount of the fees equal the amount of rebates. And it's beautiful because it's no effect on taxpayers. Taxpayers don't have to pay. Government doesn't have to pay. And it creates a strong incentive. So you can make it like maybe $3,000 fee if you have a gasoline car, and you get a $5,000 rebate to buy an electric car. All right, you know, that'll work for a lot of people. So it seems like a no-brainer. So many, and I keep trying to get the legislature to adopt it. I will succeed. So several countries in Europe already do that. No one in the US has. But, you know, if you read the newspapers, you know, we're just talking, you know, President Biden's talking about spending $50, $60, $100 billion incentives. Governor Newsom's saying the same thing. We wouldn't need any incentives from government or taxpayers if we had rebates. So if it's on the ballot, vote for it. Okay, so framing this just a little bit more. So what is good policy? you know, for the kind of policies we're talking. So I confess I've never seen this written down anywhere, except for what I've written. But this is what I think are the 5 key attributes of good policy. One is it fair and equitable? And there's a lot of ways of being equitable. You know, it's equitable across companies, equitable across people, different income groups. You know, there's different ways of talking about what's fair and what's equitable. But, you know, is it fair and equitable? 2, is it likely to be effective? You know, we adopt a lot of policies that are not very effective, don't do what they're supposed to. Is it economically efficient? So that's what the economists would say. You know, economists would say they put a gas tax, put a carbon tax on it, and we're all done. And they say that because, in theory, that's the most economically efficient way of getting change, changing behavior, changing things. But as I pointed out, you do want to be economically efficient, but that by itself won't get the job done in almost all cases. And partly it won't get it done because to be really effective, it's politically unacceptable. You know, what politician do you know that would vote for $15 a gallon gasoline? I mean, heck, which of you would vote? Well, unless you already have an electric car. How many of you drive or your family has an electric vehicle? Only a few of you. Okay, that's going to change soon. We're going to show you. And is it the policy designed well? And that means, you know, when I've been on the CARB board for 15 years, and sometimes, you know, policies are adopted. They've got loopholes in them that you can't enforce them well. And, you know, it's partly they're not effective because they're not designed well. And then the last one is it easy to administer? So like you had a policy that required, that would tell every person how they had to change their behavior and that person had to report back. Geez, what a nightmare that would be for a government. You know, they'd have to go and track you down to make sure you did it what you were supposed to do. And so it's got to be easy to administer, which means easy to enforce it. And you can't have a whole, you know, 100 or 1,000 people running that policy responsible for it. You know, that costs a lot of money. So one of the, actually, you know, have you been involved at all with the issue about gas taxes? Because, you know, right now the gas taxes exist not to change behavior or anything else. Gas taxes exist as a revenue source to pay for road construction. That's really like 95% of the reason they exist. Okay, so when the way the gas tax is done is basically it's administered at the refineries. So the taxes are paid at the refineries where they send the gasoline out. There's only like 15 refineries in the state. Now, if you do a road user charge, road tax, that's what we're talking about replacing. You know, the gasoline tax isn't going to work much longer because there's not going to be gasoline. And cars are getting more efficient and then they're getting electric. So we're going to lose all that money we gain now to pay for highways. And we still need to pay for our roads and maintenance. So how are we going to do that? So most of the focus has been on what road user charges. And that means that you have a little transponder in your car, just like for tolls. And it keeps track of how many miles you go, and it sends that information somewhere, and you get a bill that, you know, counts for how many miles you've driven. So some version of that is very likely now. But the cost of administering the gas tax is about 1% of the total revenue that's collected. The cost for these road user charges seems like it's going to be close to 10%. So it's not easy to administer. It's not cheap to administer. All right, so here, this is my growing chart about what California's policies for climate change. It used to be just a few years ago, it was much simpler. So this is a timeline starting in 1990, all the way back here. So the first thing California did is adopt the zero emission vehicle mandate, 1990, before most of you were born. And then there's just all of these policies and rules. We're only going to mostly talk about this ZEV mandate and some closely related things. But then we adopted 2000, the legislature passed a law that was required greenhouse gas standards, performance standards for light duty vehicles. It was the first law or policy like that in the world. California did that. Took a long time to get implemented because the car company filed lawsuits against it. There were all these problems, but eventually it did get adopted. So actually, I'm not going to go. You know, okay, reading through this, have you heard of most of these? Okay, how many of you have heard of AB 32? How many have not? It's about half and half, it looks like. So that was California's first law that said, we're going to reduce greenhouse gases for the entire economy, not just transportation, for everything. So what the law actually said is it would reduce emissions back to 1990 levels by 2020. In other words, what had happened is, you know, in 1990, emissions were here, but they'd been going up, up, up. And so by 2006, California said, okay, now we're going to bend that curve and bring it back to where it was in 1990. And then there was a follow-up law, SB 32, that was passed in 2016, that said, okay, we got back to 1990 levels, and now we're going to get really serious. And says, emissions for the whole state of California now must be reduced by 40% by 2030. So that is the current law. On top of that, the Governor Newsom issued an executive order that said we shall reduce emissions not just by 40% by 2030, but to zero by 2045, or net zero. You know what net zero, what I mean when I say net zero? What does it mean? I saw you shaking your head.
You can offset your emissions.
Okay, so you can offset your emissions. That means that you could like pull carbon out of the air, or you could take carbon and sequester it in the ground. So it doesn't. So when I say net zero, it doesn't mean we have to reduce our actual emissions by 100%. We could reduce it by 80% and then do these other things to get that 20% reduction. Okay, so that's where we're headed. 2045, you're going to be around. And okay, and so there's all these other things. So, and I'll come back to it, but this is kind of a chart that you can see all of. Yes?
I'm just curious, like, kind of what were the motivations of the people that passed the ZEV mandate in 1990? It seems so long ago.
Yeah, okay, the question is, what was the mandate for this? Because people weren't really talking about climate change that much at that time. They were, that was an issue. But this was done for air pollution reasons. Because we had, you know, California such horrible air pollution, especially in LA and in the Central Valley. that this was seen as one of the best strategies to reduce pollution, is to make vehicles electric, get rid of all those emissions from light-duty vehicles. So we ended up, I'll get back to this, but my agency, CAR, 4 years ago, passed this regulation requiring that all buses, all transit buses must be zero emission. So it says all must be zero emission by 2040, but that means because buses last about 12 years, that by 2027, 2028, all new sales of buses will be electric or fuel cell. So that's already in place. And actually Unitrans, for instance, they're already starting to buy electric buses, and then pretty soon I think within 2 or 3 years, all of the new buses they buy will be electric. And then we passed another regulation, CAR, in 2 years ago, that requires trucks, big trucks, to be zero emission. So it requires, so the rule says, they divide it up for different types of trucks, but for most categories, 75% of all the trucks sold by 2035 must be zero emission. That's, and that includes, by the way, these long haul tractor trailers. For them, the number is 40%, but we're going to adopt new rules that essentially get even them up to 100%. Yeah.
Curious about ECC2 still in discussion. I was wondering if you think that there will be sort of an allowance for PHEVs at some point in the future in that regulation, or we're just going to go the way of, okay, completely.
Okay, so the question is, well, I keep saying zero emission. What about plug-in hybrids? Plug-in hybrids have a little combustion engine. They're burning the fuel. And they do have emissions. They are not zero emission any way whatsoever. So how do we take that into account? So I've become a real policy wonk. I love policy because it's so interesting. And that is exactly the kind of question that I love to deal with. And so the question is, how do you deal with it? And I'm going to talk about it with respect to light-duty vehicles later. For truck, actually for trucks, I don't know the details. But basically what we say is, we want most of them to be true zero emission, but we understand that PHEVs under certain circumstances can be nearly zero. It's like, so what okay, I'm getting ahead of myself. So light duty vehicles, the new ZEV mandate is going to be adopted in the next few months. What it does is it says PHEV is equal to a battery EV for regulatory purposes, but it has to have a range, the electric range has to be at least 50 miles. Okay, that means it's got a fairly big battery in it. And so the thinking is close enough. That's the thing about policy. How do you, if you make things too simple, then you're not allowing flexibility, bad things happen. But if you make it too rigid, if you make it too flexible, then companies and people take advantage of it. So there's that sweet spot sometimes. All right. Anyone have any questions about any of this? Anything you've heard about that you're curious? So it's here. I'll be back next Monday. You can follow it. All right. So this is kind of setting the stage for the rest of it, because what I just showed you is California. Okay, let's talk a little bit about what California is up to. California is really being aggressive with climate change and dealing with it and reducing greenhouse gases. And as I showed in the previous slide, California has the most comprehensive set of laws and regulations for decarbonizing transportation of any state or country in the world. But we're not necessarily the most aggressive, but it has policies for everything. Low carbon fuel standards, policies for reducing vehicle use. We've got, you name it, we've got it. And so, one might say, is this really a smart thing for California to be doing? Is this going to lead us to the promised land, or are we going to be flood? Are the waves going to flood over us and drown us? That's a little overstated, but okay. So let's talk about California, what it's up to. Okay, as we said, there's severe air pollution in California, in large areas of California. California has the most polluted areas in the whole country. It's not nearly as polluted as India or some other cities around the world. It used to be much cleaner than it used to be. But still, pollution still is a problem. And California indeed, does especially suffer from climate change. Wildfires, we've got long coastline. So as the sea levels rise, we're going to be flooding places like San Francisco. So we need to rebuild the infrastructure, make the bridges higher, make the roads higher, and a lot more. And we have the wine industry that'll be affected. We have agriculture that'll be affected. That is being affected. We have the wildfires. All of this is related to climate change. So California is particularly susceptible, subject to the effects of climate change. The drought, is exacerbated by it. You can't blame everything on climate change, but the changing climate is affecting all of those in a negative way. So those are kind of the first kind of bad things, reason for California to lead on climate change policy. And the third one is that, maybe there's economic benefits to California. So if we develop these policies that motivate more investment in electric vehicles, and then we start exporting electric vehicles, or we start, even things like better thermostats, all kinds of new technologies, and that's going to come back and benefit. And another part I'll talk about a little later is that it turns out electric vehicles actually are going to be economically preferential to gasoline vehicles and to diesel trucks in the near term. So in fact, if California moves faster and does it, it's going to get that economic benefit as well. Yes, back there.
When you say near term, how many years?
Well, in some circumstances, electric vehicles are economically better today. So like if you have an electric car and you drive it 20,000 miles per year, you're probably coming out ahead. And that's because, the electricity is much cheaper than the gasoline. So if you only drive it 2,000 miles a year, which is not so different from my household, then it's hugely expensive. But, the cost is more upfront and you're not getting the benefits downstream. And because you also, electric vehicles have less maintenance. So if you drive it 20 or 30,000 miles a year, you're still not going to have much maintenance for it, whereas with a gasoline car, you soon will. So it depends on how you use it. It depends on how electricity prices change, how gasoline prices change. I mean, if gasoline prices stay at $5 or $6. Actually, today, probably electric vehicles are superior on a total cost of ownership basis. And over time, the cost of the electric cars, vehicles are going to continue to come down. You know, battery costs are coming down. All the companies are learning how to manufacture them more efficiently. And so the cost of an electric vehicle probably in 8, 9, 10 years will probably be about the same as the gasoline car. And then you're getting all of the benefits of the lower energy costs. So, you know, on average, we're saying in 4 or 5 years, electric vehicles should be cheaper than gasoline cars. Yeah.
What kind of like car class are you talking about? So like you're talking about like a luxury vehicle, like the costs are already on par, but are we going to get something that costs as much as a Honda Civic?
Okay, so the question is about what kind of car vehicles are we talking about? Because luxury vehicles are expensive. So when I did the analysis, you know, about being cost competitive, I was saying for a comparative vehicle, you know, same size, same basic performance. It is true that most of the electric vehicles sold today tend to be luxury vehicles and expensive. But that's going to be changing. That is changing. You know, there is the Nissan Leaf, which is more competitive, but you're going to see more and more of the downscale vehicles being electric vehicles, much cheaper, and there'll be more of them. Your thing came on the screen there. Okay, so the reason why, so California is doing much more than other states in the US. And the reason it's able to do that, much more than the federal government, is because back in 1970, Congress said, and this was written into the Clean Air, US Clean Air Act, said, California, we will give California the authority to adopt emission standards for vehicles as long as they're more stringent than the national standards. So EPA is the one that adopts national standards for air pollution and greenhouse gases. So it said that if California standards are more aggressive, more stringent, they can do their own. And then a few years later, in 1977, Congress went one step further and said, not only can California do its own thing, but any other state can follow California. So the other 49 states either have to follow EPA or California. There's no other choices. There's just two choices, California. In the beginning, everyone followed EPA, but now more and more are following California. So actually, these numbers are different for a number of states. So I just had a meeting with Honda executives today, and these are out of date. So right now, there's 15 states that follow California on zero emission vehicles, zero emission vehicle mandates. So it's mostly all of the East Coast, Northeast Coast states, plus Colorado, plus New Mexico is just doing it, plus Oregon and Washington. Minnesota is about to do it. So it tends to be the West Coast, East Coast, and now an increasing number scattered around the interior of the country. Okay, so let's focus on ZEBs now. Okay, so we're doing ZEBs. As I said, initially we did ZEBs only for air pollution reasons, only for local air pollution. Now we're doing it for climate change, and I have to, it depends who you're talking to, but I think climate change is becoming much more important. And the reason I qualify that is because, if California is going to adopt these aggressive rules and requirements, there has to be public support for it. And the reality is people are much more supportive of things that improve health than they are climate change. So if they think something's going to make the air cleaner, they're much more likely to support it and vote for it than if it's for climate change. So now, when the state adopts these laws, they always frame it and phrase it as this is for public health and climate change. Now, you can make your own judgment about which is why they're doing it. Everyone has their different motivation. The other part is, as I was on a previous slide that I didn't say, is one of the reasons is to stimulate the economy. So China, for instance, you might say, why? So China is pursuing electric vehicles very aggressively, even more so than California, or at least so far, more so than California, definitely more than the US government. Why are they doing it? And so they've got actually 4 reasons. One is air pollution. They have a lot of really polluted cities. 2 is climate change. They are buying into that. They are have goals to reduce greenhouse gases. But a third one is to leapfrog the Western car companies who are focused on combustion engines and nurture and stimulate an electric vehicle industry to get the Chinese car companies to go much faster toward electric vehicles so that eventually they'll be able to export them and they'll create an export market. Because they had hope by creating a domestic car industry that it would become competitive with the Western car companies and they would export it, and that didn't happen for the most part. And so they're trying to leapfrog right to electric vehicles more quickly. That's the third reason. We're talking about China, right? The fourth reason, can anyone guess what the fourth reason might be? Oil influence. So they are very dependent on oil imports. They're very dependent on oil. And they import more than any other country in the world, and much, much more than the US. And it costs a lot of money to the economy. So they want to reduce oil imports. So those are 4. So that's why when you have 4 strong reasons to do something, then you do it more enthusiastically than if you only have 1. So in this case, okay, so here's another one. This is a 5th one now, China, but it's also one for the US, is security. And it used to be energy, so this would be, for China, you'd say this is energy security. But for the US, it's more like minerals. Now there's big debate about if we go to electric vehicles, and the motors are made with all these rare metals and materials that are elsewhere in the world, and actually most of them are processed in China. And even a lot of the minerals, lithium and all these other minerals are being mined elsewhere. It's not that the US doesn't have the minerals in the US, but we don't have the mining industry to get them out, mostly because they're cheaper elsewhere. So mining companies go elsewhere to mine it, and then they import it to the US. So that's another reason. All right. Now we're starting to really delve into, okay, President Donald Trump. He didn't care much about environmental policy. He didn't care much about climate policy. And he really hated California. So you put those together. And he said, why are we letting California adopt its own standards? In fact, even worse than that, we're letting California adopt its own standards, and then other states are following it. And so California is setting policy for the country. That's not right. And so what they did is, so President Trump said, okay, we're going to take away California's authority to do it, to set its own standards. And they did. Well, they did, but then there were all kinds of lawsuits, whether they really could do it or not. And before any of the lawsuits were resolved, President Biden came in and he said, you know, on day one, he said, literally on day one, he said, we're giving back California its authority, and we're going to reinstate some of these policies, environmental policies like greenhouse gas standards for vehicles. So I think Alan is going to be talking on Wednesday about fuel economy and greenhouse gas standards for vehicles. So when he does, remember that these are the performance standards I was talking about. And we have those in place. They started from California back in 2002. They didn't actually get implemented. In the greenhouse gas standards didn't get implemented in 2009. So he'll tell you all the history of that. Okay, so now we're in the process. So California has its authority back. So now that's how we're adopting all these rules. All these rules, buses, trucks, and cars could not have been done during the Trump years. Yes?
What does LDV stand for?
Oh, LDV is light duty vehicles. Yeah, so it means the technical definition is a vehicle up to 8,500 pounds. So like an F-150 would be a light duty, but the F-250 or 350 probably crosses it, so it becomes a medium duty truck. Medium duty vehicle. MDV. Okay, so this is just an illustration also. In addition to what I was talking about. Congress did pass during the Obama years a tax credit of $7,500, which meant if you bought battery EV, you would get a tax credit of $7,500. But the way they did it is they said it was only for the first 200,000 vehicles sold by a particular company. So Tesla, for instance, passed that long ago. General Motors passed it a couple of years ago. Toyota is about to pass that. So if you buy a Chevy Bolt, or you buy a Tesla, you do not get that $7,500 tax. But if you buy a Volkswagen ID4, you will get that. So Congress, so there's a lot of interest in getting Congress to extend it. So that says it's not just the first 200,000, but all vehicles into this for the foreseeable future. But it's not happening. So I don't know. California has a lot of incentives, but the federal government is fading out. Okay, so let's talk. We're going to delve into the ZEV mandate policy of California. So as I said here, it's not 9, there's like 15 colleges in California, 14 or 15. Okay, so, you know, going back to, you know, where Congress said, okay, California, you can do your own thing. There's another kind of a broader philosophical, political theory about it, and that is that in the US, and going right back to the Constitution, actually, there was the idea that we should allow states to do innovative things on their own, that they would be a laboratory, a test case. And if it works in Montana or California, then the federal government, you know, could adopt it. You know, lessons learned, what works, what doesn't. Sometimes it's referred to as a laboratory of democracy. So we refer to subnational governments being any level of government below the national. So that would be the states, or it could be counties, it could be transit districts, local government, cities. So there's a long tradition in the United States about allowing it, but in some cases, you know, when a national law is adopted, then locals cannot do it. So this was the case where the Congress said, okay, we did do a national law, but we're gonna let California and other states go to work. Okay, so here's that ZEV amendment. So this is I'm going to do a long history of it. I'm going to tell you the gruesome details on this. Partly because I lived through it, I participated, I testified back in the early 90s, I testified to the card when I was just a professor. So I've been involved in this one way or another since the beginning. So it was pretty audacious. 1990s, 32 years ago, California passed this regulation that said that by 1998, which is 24 years ago, is that by 1998, 2% of the cars sold by the car companies must be zero emission. And by 2003, 10% must be zero emission. Well, we didn't even come close. But that's what they adopted. So anyway, I'm gonna take you through all of these. So the way they wrote the rule in the beginning, they made a deal with the auto industry. They said, okay, we know this is aggressive, but we're gonna require that every 2 years, there'll be a review to determine whether we should soften it or strengthen it or change it somewhere. So therefore, every 2 years, there was another review. And you can see here, the first big change was 1996. I'm going to take you through this. So a little bit on how it works itself. So just so you understand. So, you know, in a simple sense, it's just telling a car company that they have to sell a certain percentage of their vehicles as zero emission vehicles. Now, in practice, what happened is that, you know, I told you now, going forward, we're going to treat a PhD the same as that, but that's not until 2026. Up through 2026, you know, including now, including before, we had this complicated system for giving credits to vehicles. You know, this is like being a professor, you know, or a student, you want to get it technically right. So you say, okay, should a Honda Fit, tiny little car, be treated the same as a GM Suburban, Chevy Suburban, or an F-150? Doesn't seem right? Okay, so now you say, okay, well then how do you determine how many credits you would give to that Honda Fit versus that Chevy Suburban? Okay, so it uses much less energy, it's much lighter, much smaller. What do you do? And, you know, you can, for every vehicle, you know, you think about it. So include PHEVs in this, you know, you can have different size batteries. So you could have, you know, like the first Nissan Leaf, they said it got 100 miles. I owned one of them. I was lucky to get 80 miles. But anyway, we'll give them, we'll give them credit and say, okay, it was a 100-mile vehicle. But then there were others that had 300 miles of range. So do you give that Nissan Leaf the same amount of credit as a Tesla that goes 300 miles? And then what about those PHEVs that only go 10 miles on electricity? Okay, let's get creative here. Okay, we're going to think, we're going to try to get you to think like a regulator or policymaker. Okay, what criteria or what variables, what attributes would you use to determine how many, whether something gets more credits than others? I kind of gave you a hint already, more than a hint. What was the example I just gave you? I gave you two of them. One big one. Okay, come on, got to start thinking here. What's that?
Battery size.
Battery size. Okay, it could be battery size. If you put a big battery in, you get more credit. That's possible. So we're talking about what's possible. So that's one. What else could you use?
I don't know if that answers.
Range, okay. So no, that's different. Range is different than battery size, because you could put a huge battery in that F-150 or that Suburban and still might not go very far. You put that huge battery in a Honda Fit, it'll go 600 miles. Okay, so we got another one. Okay, the other is a range. Anything else? Emissions per mile. Okay, that would work with a PHEV, right? Or it could, okay, maybe you're thinking about the upstream emissions.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so the other could be, you taken Alyssa Kendall's life cycle class? Has anyone taken, you're mostly undergraduates, but you've taken it? Okay, yeah, okay, a few of you. So the idea of life cycle analysis is you take into account all of the emissions associated with that product or that activity. So, you know, that's why I said the electric vehicle is not really a zero emission vehicle, because it's all the emissions from the power plants that are producing the electricity. Never mind the amount of energy that went into making the battery and making the product. But we'll set that part aside. We'll just talk about upstream emissions, meaning the emissions from. So yeah, so you could award the credits based upon the life cycle emissions. There's different ways of defining the life cycle, but you know, a simple one would be the upstream emissions, and that's what be it. But, and then if it's a plug-in hybrid, whatever emissions are coming from the engine. Okay, that's a good one. So all of these are good ones. Actually, all of them are very good ones. Are there any others you can think of? Size. Yeah, you could say, okay, how would you do it though?
Well, you'd be like more passengers or.
Oh, if it has more seats in it, maybe. Yeah, okay. You could do that if it had, yeah, if it had more seats or more volume. Would you give it more credit or less credit?
Maybe more.
I might argue that parking seats, yeah, that's another. Yeah.
Would you scale the incentive on the MSRP?
Okay, so based upon the selling price of the vehicle, based on that. Okay, yes, as a matter of fact. Okay, so why would you do that? How would you do that? What would be the motivation for that?
I'm kind of like asking you.
I'm not yet. We haven't got to the point of what's a good idea or not. We're just on that, legitimate idea. So based upon the price, okay, so where it has come in is from a social justice perspective. So like, should we be giving a lot of credits to big, huge Mercedes? Or should we then, we use it. So actually we use it more on the incentive money rather than the regulations. So it's a good idea, but it's probably more relevant for incentives. So we do incentive money if the price, actually I should say this up for another discussion on incentives. Okay. Okay, let me digress. Let's do it with incentives too. Okay, because we did most of the major ones for performance standard mandate. Those were all the good ones. I think maybe one of them, but what about incentives? So okay, we'll start with yours. That was, when you're going to hand out incentives to people, in other words, if you buy an electric car, we're going to give you money to buy the electric car. So I told you about the federal incentive, $7,500. Okay, and in that case, they gave, okay, the only thing they did in that case was any vehicle of any size, if it's a pure battery, you get $7,500. And actually what they did is that they used battery size in that case. They said if the battery is, they said actually if the battery is more than 16 kilowatt hours, you get the full 7,500. Anyone have any idea why they picked 16 kilowatt hours?
That was the size of the battery.
Exactly. How did you know that? That's good. Right. And so that's a U.S. car. A lot of it, there's some nationalism going on. So, General Motors, and the Volt plug-in hybrid. It wasn't even a battery EV. This is Volt with a V. It had, at that time, about 35 miles of range, but it had a 16 kilowatt hour battery. So they said anything with 16 kilowatt or more gets the full drive. And then they made it less. So you had a down to, I think, 5 kilowatt. You got 5 kilowatt hours. You got 25. Okay. Actually, so we just did 2 things there. Okay, so I gave you another one. So one was battery size. In that case, it was battery size. Okay, the MSRP, or the price of the vehicle, that is being used. You want to give government money, taxpayer money to rich people. So if you buy a $100,000 car, you're rich. And should we be giving you taxpayer money? Should we be subsidizing rich people? Okay, so one thing we do is say if it's over a certain number, you don't get any incentive money. Okay, how are other ways of adjusting the incentive money? There's one really big one. Who should we, it's again along the same lines. Who should we be giving the money to? What's that?
People that are commuting a lot.
Well, that's an interesting one. Yeah, it could be if you accumulated 15,000 miles, 20,000 miles per year. That's how you can measure it, right? Because you always have to have something that's measurable. So that could be one. The problem with that is, they might say they're going to do it, but how do you know? You could give it to them after a year if they actually look at that. But that's a very reasonable possibility. Yeah. Income. Yeah, that's the most obvious one. Is if you're, because if you do it on the price of the vehicle, that's kind of a surrogate or a proxy for income. It's an easy way of doing it. Okay, why is it easier than using income as the attribute? So think about that a little bit. How would you actually do it? Based on income. What's that?
What do they report on their tax?
Yeah, what do they report on your tax? Okay, now think about that. Are we going to make people bring their pile of income tax returns to the dealer? And then you're asking the dealer to take responsibility. Dealers do not want any liability or any responsibility for something like that. But so that would be one way of doing it. Okay, I'll give you some other ways of doing that is you pre-qualify beforehand. You know, you go on a website, and, accesses your IRS data and so on. But that means in that case, you have to plan way ahead. You have to say, okay, a month or 2 months before you're going to buy the car, you go through that whole process. A lot of people don't do that. What's that?
It might be incentivize.
Incentivize? Yeah, that's right. That's right. Well, you'd be surprised how people are. They don't do what's rational. Okay. So I got incentives, but you can do incentives. Okay, let me rattle off before I get back to this. So I'm going to be carrying over this lecture till next Monday. I'll be adding a little bit more international next Monday. But okay, let's talk about incentives. So the best incentives are ones where you walk in the dealer and they either give you a check for your incentive check or they subtract it from the price of the car. Like the federal credit, you have to wait until you file your tax returns, and then you submit it, and then you get it back, maybe a year later. Now, as a consumer, which would you rather have? Which would be more influential in your decision? Walking into a dealer, then writing it down by 7,500, or them saying, here's some paperwork, fill it out, send it to Uncle Sam, and maybe you'll get the money back in a year. I mean, it's pretty obvious. So, some of the research shows that if you do it, we call that point of sale or on the hood, is a more colloquial way of saying it. So you give the incentive on the hood, point of sale, it's something like 3 times more influential than if you say, the check's in the mail. It's kind of like, when you buy products and they have a little rebate in it, you have to send it in. A lot of people never do it. It doesn't really play nearly as much of a role as if you walked into that Walmart or Target and they debited the price from your washing machine or computer or whatever, or cell phone, smartphone. Okay, so back to, see, I'm kind of getting you into the, does that one give you time off for a break? See a nice guy? 8 minutes. Oh, but we're already at 6:30, sorry. Yeah.
A question on this. Why aren't all the incentives on the so
okay, so why aren't all the incentives on the hood? It would be so much smarter. Okay. But that means that, okay, so you can't do income, do it on the basis of income very easily, right? You can, you do the, that's why I mentioned you can pre-qualify, but that gets complicated and there's been issues with that. And that's why the one that's most popular is basically on the vehicle price. So in California, I have a table on all the incentives. We'll go through it. That's the easiest thing. So, you know, the other thing about policy, remember, it's got to be easy to administer, easy to enforce. I'm kind of working it through. So this is my policy one lecture here to get you thinking about from the point of view of how do you come up with good policy? What is good policy? And how does it work? Yes?
I guess the corollary, though, the federal policy, it's not based on income, right?
No.
So in that case, it would make much more sense. It's more of a like, it's easier to pass that sort of policy, and that's why we did it that way, or is there more to it than that?
Exactly right. And I don't, you know, what Congress does is often doesn't use it. So the federal one has two huge flaws. One of them is just this, it doesn't take income into account. The other is it's not at the point of sale. So it's really, I mean, we're wasting. I mean, a lot of the money is going to rich people and all of it is, none of it's at point of sale. So it's having much less effect than it was at point of sale. So, I mean, this is a huge waste of taxpayer money. I mean, maybe that's overstating, but it could be used much more effectively. So, in other words, that's what we call not good policy, and in a nasty mood, call it bad policy. So that was a good question. Good observation. Okay, so the way it works is every vehicle, I'm going to go through it. They made there is a determination made how many credits does every vehicle get. And PHEVs were an option, but they only could car companies. So the regulated party here is the car company. Okay, so that's another one. You think of policy, you got to think of, you know, who is the policy or the regulation being imposed on? So in this case, it's the car company. And by the way, one of the reasons they put on the car company is it's much easier to put on the car company than the individual consumer, because there's only, you know, 15 or 20 car companies, and there's, you know, every year there's 2 million people buying cars in California. Okay, so how do you deal with PHEVs? Partly they get less credit, partly a car company only can get credit for a certain number of PHEVs. Okay, and then there's some complicated stuff about credit. I'll show you a slide on that. And then there's some other things. Okay, another key part I should have put down here is the credits are tradable. In other words, if Chrysler, which is known not to be very good at technology, not to be a leader, if they decide if they think it's too expensive to sell electric cars, or they just don't want to do it, then they can buy credits from someone else that is, you know, meeting the requirement. So everyone's required to sell a certain number. So if General Motors is selling more than they have to, then they can sell their extra credits to Chrysler. And indeed, that is what happened. Now, what really happened is Tesla came along. And Tesla sold a massive number of cars, electric cars. And so almost everyone was buying credits from Tesla. So Tesla got incredibly subsidized by the other car companies. In fact, I have a slide on some of the numbers. Some of the early Tesla cars, like the Model S, like 2012, 2013, 2014, Tesla got about $20,000 in credits they sold to other car companies for every car they sold. So that Model S, $20,000 of the cost was covered by other car companies buying credits from Tesla. So, or another way of thinking about that car earned Tesla $20,000. Every car they sold earned them $20,000. Even today, they're getting probably something like $3,000 per car for every car they sell. All right, so California really was a leader. It did the ZEP mandate after that. But in recent years, other countries have gotten really aggressive on electric vehicles. So China, Germany, France, Sweden, Norway. Norway is now at 90%. 90% of sales of cars in Norway now are either battery electric or plug-in hybrid. And most of those are battery electric, 65 or 70%. All cars sold in Norway. Norway is basically gone already.
Yeah. How many purchases a year?
How many what?
Car purchases a year. How many cars are bought in Norway per year?
How many cars are sold in Norway per year? Yeah, Norway's a tiny.
Yeah,
it sounds like a big, it looks big on the map. You hear it all the time. They have 5 million people. 5 million people, that's much less than the Bay Area. That's the whole country. And they're a rich country because they have lots of oil. And so not only are they an advanced industrialized country, but they sell a lot of oil. So they've been giving away massive amounts of subsidies and incentives for people to buy. So that's why we don't really use Norway as an example, just because it's kind of an outlier. But other countries, Sweden, Germany, France, they're all now into the they're over 20% of sales. China too, and China is massive. And so California is starting to increase now. It's up to, the first part of this year was up to 15, 16% of sales. But it's been around 10% for a number of years. But that's going to change very soon. All right, so we've talked. Okay, let's do a little history. 1990. That's when CARB adopted what they call the low emission vehicle program that included the ZEV mandate. And the real focus of that was to start reducing the regular emissions of vehicles, the NOx emissions, CO, hydrocarbon, VOCs. But they included this, the ZEV mandate. Okay, that was 1990. And they did that. So right there in the corner, you see the first. Actually, this car here is what inspired this ZEV. So General Motors, like in 1989, General Motors, Chevy, built this car. At the time, it was called an Impact. It built it as a prototype to show what could be done with electric vehicles. And they showed it around, and car regulators got real excited, and they said, well, if GM can build it, then mandate it. So car companies are actually very reluctant now to bring out new cars that are, that are subject to regulations where they beat the regulations by a lot, because then they're afraid CARB or EPA will just adopt more aggressive regulations. Yeah, a little digression on that point. So what I said is just true. But nowadays in the US, in the world, bankers, investment community, they think electric vehicles are the future, and they think companies that are really committed to electric vehicles are worth a lot of money. And so people that buy shares of stock and investors in Wall Street, they really like car companies that are really committed to electric vehicles, like Tesla. Any of you know what the value of Tesla is? It's close to $1 trillion in terms of its value of its share. It is worth more than GM, Chrysler, Ford, and Toyota all put together. And it makes a tiny fraction of many cars because the bankers in Wall Street thinks that Tesla is the future, that they're going to continue building up market share. They're going to continue to sell vehicles. They're going to be able to do it at a low cost, and so on. So actually, when companies make announcements now, they're torn because they don't want to say they can do all these electric vehicles, because then the regulators will require more to be sold. But on the other hand, they say it because they want the investment community to value their company more. So they have this real tension going on. Anyway, so this car eventually was produced a few years later. It was called the EV1. They only actually sold 1,000 of them. Actually, the first car, for a while, first few years, they used lead acid batteries. Really, they were relatively cheap, but it didn't last very long. It didn't have much energy density. All right. Have you talked about, as Alan brought up, the impact of EV1 at all? You heard about the EV1? You must have said it in passing.
You mentioned it.
Mentioned it. Okay. So this is the EV1. Okay, the first, so we did these reviews every 2 years. First two were performed in 1996. They realized, the car companies were belly aching. They said, we can't do it. It's too expensive. It's too hard. People don't buy it. And so CARB said, okay, you're right. So they said, okay, they did a big review and they said, okay, the batteries aren't ready. Lead acid batteries weren't good enough for an electric car. Advanced battery technology wasn't yet available. So they delayed it. And actually, they delayed it till 2003. And all they did is require the companies to do a few vehicles, demonstration vehicles. It says here 1,800. I thought it was 3,000. Anyway, just a few. They only had to do a few vehicles. Then in 1998, they did another review and they said, yeah, 2000, definitely this is a problem. They're still expensive and doesn't look like consumers want to buy them. And so they've watered it down more. What they did is they came up with a new kind of description of a vehicle, partial zero emission vehicle. Anyone heard of a PZEV? Anyone own a Subaru that's 5 or 10 years old? Seen one? You go look on it. It says in little chrome on the outside of the vehicle, PZEV. So Subaru decided to take credit for being a PZEV. What a PZEV is a gasoline car that had somewhat lower emissions of hydrocarbons and NOx. It's definitely not an electric vehicle, definitely not anything close to a zero emission. I mean, even that acronym, partial zero emission. What's partial zero? It doesn't even make sense in the English language. So anyway, starting then, car companies could get credit for these PZEVs as a way of meeting the ZEV mandate. So what you see here is CARB starting to get creative about not having to water it down even more. So they came up with creative ways that car companies can get credits. The other, okay, and then in 2003, they came up with a whole nother scheme for how car companies could get credits. Said if they did fuel cell cars, they did even a small number of fuel cell cars, that would be enough to meet the ZEV mandate requirement. So here's what it was. From, you know, it would be like the first few years, they only have it out to 250. It did go up over time. Because, you know, if you go back in history, the decade like 2000 to about 2007, there was a lot of enthusiasm about hydrogen and fuel cell vehicles. In fact, we had the first hydrogen station in California at UC Davis here, out at the fleet, where the fleet cars are. And Arnold Schwarzenegger, who was governor at the time, but I should have brought, I got all kinds of photos. Arnold Schwarzenegger came and anointed it as the first hydrogen station on the hydrogen highway in California. So there was a big ceremony. Lots of fun. George Bush Jr., who was the president at the time, he thought fuel cells were the answer, and we made a big deal about it. That was the State of the Union speech. So in that time period, about 5, 6, 7 years, a lot of people and companies thought fuel cells were going to be the dominant technology, not batteries. What happened is everyone started thinking about it more, and they said, you know, with electric vehicles, all we have to do is come up with a good car. For a fuel cell car, we have to come up with a good car, and we have to come up with a whole new energy system, energy supply system. So it was that thinking really that convinced policymakers to back off from fuel cells, go back to battery EVs. All right, so okay, so in 2003 they did more things. You know, they did. CARB started getting creative. They didn't want to back down, water down the ZEV mandate any. So they came up with all these ways car companies could generate credits to meet the requirements, that even hybrid cars, you know, like the Prius, could get credits. CNG cars could get credits. These PZEVs could get credits. Oh, and it was at this time where the credits became tradable. So, okay, I jumped in a little bit. Yeah. Okay, so they did that. Then finally, in 2009, kind of started stabilizing. Say, okay, no more backsliding, no more softening. So they started requiring, so here's what they required. A total of 25,000 to be sold in 2012 and 2014, increasing to 50,000 in 2015. And so I put up this slide only because this is how we started categorizing all those credits. There were your gold credits, silver credits, and bronze. Those pizza, they were bronze. Advanced technology, that was like CNG and hybrids, or advanced technology, and they were silver. And then the gold standard was a battery EV. And they got the most credits.
What was the penalty for non-compliance per vehicle?
$5,000 per vehicle. And so, you know, no one ever paid the penalty because that looks really bad in the newspapers, you know, that you were penalized. So they would always buy credits from someone else, even though they hated giving paying Elon Musk. It really drove them crazy. But they did it as a preferable. Okay, so here was my personal involvement. So I'll end the class with this story. I was a brand new board member. You know, I was ITS director at that time, as well as I had done this job forever. You can make any judgment about that. So I had the transportation seat. I was the expert on vehicles, even though I was brand new to the board. But we had a brand new board chair, Mary Nichols. And so I worked with Mary, and we crafted those requirements that I just showed, about 25,000. And there was a very aggressive, at that time, very aggressive interest group, you know, for electric vehicles. I might closely call them fanatics, but that's more based on what we did in here. So they got really upset at me and Mary Nichols, and I think they thought I was more vulnerable. And so they really went after me. They started saying that I was just, because what they wanted is much more aggressive requirements. These were the, you know, the EV, you know, local EV clubs and lobbyists for electric vehicles. And they just wanted a much more aggressive set of requirements in 2009, 2008, 2009 than what we did. So they said, so that's what they did here. They said I was bought out by car companies, because there were car companies that were sponsoring some of the research at ITS and still are. And in the end, actually, if you read the article, they really watered down the article. But the reporter was so committed to the story. What happened is these people went to the reporter and said, you know, got to go after this guy. And the reporter did, and he put all this time into it. He collected all this data, information, talked to all these people. But then he started realizing, you know, there really wasn't much to the story after all. But he was committed to, you know, the reporter had to get a story out there. And so he wrote the story, and if you read the article, you know, you find it. It's pretty minor. It's pretty weak. It doesn't really say much. But the headline, whoever wrote the headline, that was a kind of nasty headline. So this was my first lesson in politics. Mary Nichols, she was the chair of our for like 13 years. She'd been around, you know, she's one of the most admired environmentalists ever. And so she told me, you know, everyone knows it's not true. So just ignore it. It'll go away. And you need to have a thick skin. Just have a thick skin, but not too thick. And that was her advice. You know, just make sure everyone knows who you are, that you're credible. So there was never one more story ever written. No one picked up the story. It just kind of deprecated us. That was my lesson in politics and media. All right, any thoughts before we close? So you can see the slides that are posted on the website. We'll finish up on this, and then we'll give a little bit more on international context. And meanwhile, Wednesday, Alan's going to talk to you about FA standards and greenhouse gas standards and how that relates to that. Thank you.